The phone rang at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, cutting through the usual quiet of my Anchorage office. Most potential clients called in the morning, eager to plan their adventures. Afternoon calls usually meant someone was desperate or dealing with an emergency. Torres Wilderness Expeditions, I answered, glancing at the stack of unpaid invoices on my desk. Mr. Torres, my name is Anthony Bianchi. I need your services for an expedition to Montague Island. Rich voice, East Coast accent, the kind of tone that came from never having to ask for anything twice. Montague Island's pretty remote, I said, pulling up the map on my computer screen. What kind of timeline are we talking about? 3 days from now. I understand you charge premium rates for short notice. 3 days. Most clients booked months in advance for the kind of terrain Montague offered. The island sat in the Gulf of Alaska, roughly 60 miles from the nearest mainland port. Not exactly a weekend camping trip. Depends on what you're planning to do out there. Hunting, research, photography, ecosystem study. My team needs to collect samples and document wildlife patterns. Nothing invasive. Vague answer. In 15 years of guiding expeditions through Alaska's most dangerous terrain, I'd learned to read the spaces between words. Clients who stayed general about their objectives usually had something to hide. How many people in your party? 4 total, including myself. We'll need transportation to the island and guidance for inland exploration. I quoted my standard rate for remote island expeditions, adding a 20% surcharge for the short notice. The number would make most people reconsider their timeline. 50,000 should cover it, Bianchi said without hesitation. 50,000. My standard rate was 12,000 for a week-long expedition. This guy was offering more than 4 times that amount. Mr. Bianchi, I think there might be some confusion about the pricing. No confusion. 50,000 for 1 week, all expenses covered. I value discretion and expertise. From what I've heard, you provide both. My computer screen showed the outstanding balance on my office lease, the overdue payment notice from my equipment supplier, and the reminder about my truck's transmission repair. 50,000 would clear every debt and leave enough to upgrade my gear for next season. I'll need to research the location and check weather patterns, I said, already knowing I'd take the job. Montague Island isn't exactly tourist-friendly. Excellent. I'm staying at the Hotel Captain Cook downtown, Suite 2847. Can you meet this evening to discuss details? After hanging up, I spent the next 3 hours researching everything I could find about Montague Island. What I discovered made me wish I'd asked more questions during the call. 6 months earlier, a team of marine biologists from the University of Alaska had vanished on Montague Island. The 5-person research team had been studying seabird populations and marine ecosystems. Their last radio contact came on day 4 of what was supposed to be a 2-week expedition. Coast Guard search teams found their base camp empty with no signs of struggle or emergency. Personal belongings remained untouched, but all scientific equipment and data had disappeared. The Coast Guard launched extensive air and sea searches. 2 rescue helicopters lost radio contact while flying over the island's interior. Both aircraft were eventually located crashed in dense forest, with all crew members dead. Official reports blamed sudden weather changes and equipment malfunctions, but local pilots started avoiding Montague Island's airspace entirely. Native Alaskan communities in the region had stories about the island going back generations. Most refused to discuss specifics, but the general consensus was clear. Montague Island was a place people avoided. I printed the research and headed downtown, telling myself I was just being thorough. $50,000 bought a lot of thoroughness. The Hotel Captain Cook took up a full city block in downtown Anchorage, the kind of place where politicians stayed during legislative sessions and oil executives conducted business over expensive dinners. The elevator carried me to the 28th floor, where thick carpeting muffled my footsteps. Bianchi answered the door before I finished knocking. Late 50s, maybe early 60s, with the kind of grooming that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His outdoor gear looked fresh from the store. Gore-Tex jacket with tags still attached, hiking boots without a scuff mark, pants that had never seen actual wilderness. "Mr. Torres, thank you for coming on such short notice." The suite was larger than my apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows showing views of Cook Inlet. 2 other men sat in leather chairs near the windows. One was thin and pale, constantly messing with some kind of electronic device. The other looked like he could break me in half without much effort. "My associate David Doyle," Bianchi said, gesturing toward the thin man. "He handles our technical requirements." David looked up briefly, nodded, then went back to the device in his hands. He seemed nervous, like he couldn't sit still. His outdoor clothes looked more practical than Bianchi's, but still new. "And Robert Heller provides security consultation." Robert stood to shake my hand. Military bearing, crew cut, the kind of watchful eyes that checked everything in a room within seconds of entering. His grip was firm but not aggressive, and he looked at my face like he was memorizing it. "Security consultation for an ecosystem study?" I asked. "Remote locations present various risks," Bianchi said smoothly. "Robert ensures our safety while we focus on research." Reasonable explanation, but it didn't explain why someone conducting ecosystem research needed a bodyguard who looked like he'd spent time in places where people shot at each other for a living. Bianchi spread maps across the coffee table, pointing to Montague Island's northern coastline. "We need to access the interior forest areas, approximately 5 to 8 miles inland from the beach." The location he pointed to was marked as thick forest on the topographical maps. Difficult terrain, but nothing I hadn't handled before. What concerned me was the complete lack of detail about what they planned to do once we got there. "What kind of samples are you collecting? Soil, plant material, wildlife specimens?" "Various organic materials," David said without looking up from his device. "We have specialized equipment for proper collection and preservation." Another vague answer. I'd worked with legitimate research teams before, and they usually couldn't stop talking about their specific objectives. These guys acted like they were discussing classified military operations. "The missing biologists," I said, pulling out my printed research. "You're aware of what happened to the last team that went to Montague Island?" Bianchi's face didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes. Not surprise. More like he was annoyed that I'd brought up something he didn't want to talk about. "Tragic accident," he said. "Poor planning and inadequate preparation. That's precisely why we're hiring someone with your expertise. The Coast Guard lost 2 helicopters searching for them. Weather conditions in the Gulf of Alaska can change rapidly," Robert said. His voice carried the flat tone of someone stating facts rather than offering opinions. "Mechanical failures aren't uncommon in remote operations." True enough, but something about his delivery suggested he was reciting rehearsed talking points rather than expressing genuine concern. Bianchi opened a briefcase and pulled out packages of cash. $100 bills wrapped in bank bands, more money than I'd seen in one place since buying my truck. $25,000 now, he said, placing half the packages on the table, the remainder when we returned to Anchorage. The money sat there like a challenge. Everything about this expedition felt wrong. The secrecy, the unclear objectives, the complete lack of concern about the missing biologists. Smart money said, walk away, find a different client, stick to the safer expeditions that kept my bills paid without risking my life. But $50,000 was more than financial security. It meant freedom from the constant worry about equipment failures, office rent, and emergency repairs. It meant I could be picky about future clients instead of taking whatever work came through the door. "When do we leave?" I asked, reaching for the money. "Thursday morning," I've chartered a fishing vessel from Seward. The crossing should take approximately 8 hours. David finally looked up from his device. Weather forecast shows clear conditions for the next week. Minimal wind, calm seas. Good conditions for the boat trip, but weather in the Gulf of Alaska changed faster than most people could react. I'd seen perfectly calm mornings turn into survival situations by afternoon. "I'll need a complete equipment list," I said, pocketing the cash, "and contact information for your charter captain." "Everything's arranged," Bianchi said. "We have sufficient supplies and communication equipment. Your role is navigation and wilderness expertise." Another non-answer that told me nothing useful. In my experience, clients who wanted to handle all the details themselves usually had something to hide from their guide. But $25,000 was currently in my jacket pocket, and the promise of another $25,000 made it easier to ignore the growing list of red flags. "Meet at the Seward Harbor, Thursday morning, 6 a.m., Bianchi said, standing to indicate the meeting was over. "Slip B7. The vessel is called Northern Wind." I shook hands with each of them, noticing that David's palm was sweating, even though it was cool in the suite. Robert's handshake was the same as before, firm, professional, and completely unreadable. Walking back to my truck, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking the situation. Rich clients often acted secretive about their activities, especially when they were paying premium rates for exclusive access to remote locations. The missing biologists were a tragic coincidence, but Alaska was full of places where people disappeared due to poor preparation or bad luck. The money felt solid in my pocket, more real than my doubts about Bianchi's true motives. $50,000 bought a lot of benefit of the doubt, even from someone who'd spent 15 years learning to trust his instincts about dangerous situations. Thursday morning was 48 hours away, plenty of time to prepare for whatever ecosystem study required a bodyguard and complete secrecy. I stood on the dock at Seward Harbor, breathing the sharp salt air while waiting for my clients to arrive. The northern wind bobbed gently at slip B7, exactly where Bianchi had said it would be. 40-foot commercial fishing vessel with enough deck space for our gear, and a wheelhouse that looked like it had weathered 30 years of Gulf of Alaska storms. The captain came out from the cabin as I approached, a weathered man in his 60s with hands like leather and eyes that had seen every kind of weather these waters could throw at a boat. His beard was more gray than black, and he moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on a pitching deck. "You Torres?" he asked, looking me over with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent decades evaluating whether passengers would be more trouble than they were worth. "That's right. You're taking us to Montague Island." Something changed in his expression. Not fear exactly, but the kind of wariness that came from local knowledge. He looked toward the harbor entrance, then back at me. "Been fishing these waters for 32 years, he said. "Never had anyone ask to go to Montague Island before. You sure that's where you want to end up? My clients are researchers. They need to study the ecosystem out there." The captain made a sound that might have been a laugh, but held no humor. "Ecosystem. Right." He pointed toward the wheelhouse. "Coffee's hot if you want some. Your people show up, we can get this over with." 20 minutes later, Bianchi arrived in a black SUV with David and Robert. They moved efficiently, unloading gear bags and equipment cases without conversation. Anthony looked every bit the wealthy outdoorsman in his pristine jacket and unmarked boots. David held a metal briefcase like it contained something more valuable than scientific instruments. Robert carried himself with the same watchful tension I'd noticed at the hotel, looking around the dock and nearby boats before focusing on our vessel. "Gentlemen," the captain said as they boarded. "Name's Jim Kowalski. I'll be your chauffeur for the next 8 hours." Anthony stepped forward with his practiced smile. "Anthony Bianchi, we appreciate you taking us on such short notice. Kowalski's expression didn't change. Short notice is one thing. Montague Island's another. You folks know anything about that place? We've done our research, David said, still gripping his briefcase. His voice carried the nervous edge I'd heard at the hotel. Research. Kowalski shook his head. My grandfather was a Aleut, used to tell stories about that island when I was a kid. Called it Angwin, which meant place of the angry spirits. Never went near it, even when the fishing was good everywhere else. Robert spoke for the first time since boarding. Superstitions aren't uncommon in isolated communities. The way he said it made it clear he didn't put much stock in local folklore. Kowalski studied him for a moment, taking in the military bearing and the careful way Robert positioned himself between the others and potential threats. Maybe so, Kowalski said. But I've been out here long enough to know when something doesn't feel right. 6 months ago, those university people went missing out there. Coast Guard lost 2 choppers looking for them. Equipment failures, Anthony said smoothly. Poor weather conditions. Weather was fine that week. I was fishing 20 miles south, calm seas, clear skies. Kowalski started the engine, the diesel rumbling to life with a sound that vibrated through the deck. But you're paying the fare, so we go where you want to go. We cleared the harbor entrance and headed southwest into Prince William Sound. The morning was crisp and clear, with just enough chop to remind everyone they were on the water. I found a spot near the stern where I could watch my clients while keeping an eye on our wake trailing behind us. David had found a corner where he could work with his electronic devices without being watched too closely. Every few minutes, he checked what looked like a GPS unit, then looked at a handheld device that definitely wasn't standard camping equipment. The screen showed patterns I didn't recognize, graphs or readings that meant nothing to me but clearly mattered to him. Anthony stood near the bow, studying charts that he'd pulled from his own gear rather than asking Kowalski for navigation information. The charts looked official, but he kept them folded so I couldn't see details. When I moved closer, he casually moved to block my view. Robert had put himself where he could watch both the horizon and his clients at the same time. He wasn't seasick even with the boat's steady rocking, and his eyes moved constantly between potential sight lines. Whatever he'd done before this job, it had taught him to expect trouble from multiple directions. Beautiful country out here, I said, settling next to Anthony at the rail. Indeed. Anthony folded his chart and tucked it inside his jacket. I understand you've guided expeditions throughout Alaska. 15 years, mostly hunting and photography, some research teams. I gestured toward David's corner. What kind of data is your associate collecting? Atmospheric readings, electromagnetic measurements, standard environmental assessment. Standard environmental assessment didn't usually require encrypted communication devices or metal briefcases, but Anthony's tone suggested the conversation was over. He moved toward the wheelhouse, leaving me with the growing certainty that everything he'd told me was carefully crafted misdirection. 3 hours into the crossing, Kowalski called me to the wheelhouse. The GPS showed us roughly halfway to our destination, with Montague Island appearing as a green blip on the edge of the screen. Your clients, Kowalski said quietly. They're not what they seem. What makes you say that? 32 years on these waters. I've hauled researchers before. Real ones ask about tides, weather patterns, local wildlife. They want to know about currents, safe anchorages, emergency procedures. He nodded toward Anthony. Your boss there acts like he already knows everything about where we're going. I looked back at my clients. Anthony was checking his hidden charts again. David had 3 different devices running at the same time. Robert kept his careful watch, but now I noticed he was paying close attention to the direction of Montague Island, as if he expected something to show up on the horizon. The university team that disappeared, I said. You know anything more than what made the news? Kowalski was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he spoke without taking his eyes off the water ahead. "I was the one who found their boat." The words hit like cold water. The Coast Guard report said their vessel was never located. Official reports say a lot of things. Coast Guard asked me to keep quiet about it. Kowalski's hands tightened on the wheel. "Found their boat drifting 20 miles southeast of the island. Engine was running, radio was working, emergency beacon was active, but no people aboard." "Where were they?" "That's the question, isn't it?" "Boat was in perfect condition. Food was still warm in the galley. Personal belongings were untouched, but 5 people had just vanished." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What did you tell the Coast Guard?" "Everything I just told you. They logged it as equipment failure and probable drowning. Boat must have experienced mechanical problems. People abandoned ship, got picked up by currents." Kowalski shook his head. "Except the boat wasn't damaged. And these waters don't hide bodies for long. Things wash up. But the search teams found their camp on the island. They found a camp, tents, supplies, some personal items. But I'm telling you, those people never made it back to their boat. Whatever happened to them happened on Montague Island." David appeared in the wheelhouse doorway. "How much longer to our destination?" 4 hours, Kowalski said, his tone shifting back to professional courtesy. "Weather's holding steady." David nodded and returned to his corner, but not before I caught him checking his watch and making notes on a waterproof pad. He was tracking our progress like someone following a specific timeline. By mid-afternoon, Montague Island had become visible as a dark line on the horizon. Even from 30 miles away, something about it looked wrong. The island was too dark against the surrounding water, as if it soaked up light rather than bouncing it back. No seabirds flew around its shores, even though the rich fishing grounds should have brought flocks of gulls and cormorants. "Notice anything unusual?" I asked Kowalski. "Dead water," he said grimly. "Should be seeing birds, sea lions, whale spouts. This time of year, these waters are usually full of life." As we drew closer, the silence became more noticeable. The normal sounds of sea wildlife, bird calls, splashing, the distant huffing of whales, were completely gone. Even the water looked different, darker and somehow thicker than the normal blue-green of Prince William Sound. Anthony came up from below deck carrying a GPS unit and what looked like a compass, though it was larger and more complex than any navigation instrument I'd seen. He looked at both devices, then pointed toward the island's northern shore. "We need to land there," he said, indicating a stretch of rocky coastline that looked completely unsuitable for beaching a 40-foot vessel. Kowalski looked at the shoreline through binoculars. "That's a dangerous approach. Rocky bottom, no protected anchorage. South side has better beaches. The northern shore," Anthony repeated with the tone of someone accustomed to having his instructions followed without question. "Your funeral," Kowalski muttered, but he adjusted course toward Anthony's chosen landing site. As we approached the island, the temperature dropped noticeably. I zipped my jacket and noticed the others doing the same. The afternoon sun seemed less effective here, as if the island's presence dimmed its warmth. Robert joined me at the rail, studying the coastline ahead. Up close, Montague Island looked even more unwelcoming. Dense forest grew almost to the water's edge, broken only by narrow strips of rocky beach. The trees were wrong somehow, too thick, too dark, growing in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Ever been anywhere like this?" I asked Robert. "Remote islands? Plenty of them. I mean anywhere that felt..." I struggled for the right word. "Wrong." Robert's expression didn't change, but he was quiet for several seconds before answering. "Few places in Afghanistan, areas where locals wouldn't go no matter what you paid them. They'd say the land was cursed, or that spirits lived there." "Did you believe them?" I learned to trust local knowledge. People who've lived somewhere for generations usually know things outsiders miss. Kowalski moved us toward a narrow inlet between jagged rocks. The water was so clear I could see the bottom 15 feet down, covered with kelp that moved in patterns that didn't match the current. As we got closer to shore, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The beach was covered with bones. Not human bones. Animal remains, fish skeletons, bird bones. Thousands of them scattered across the rocky shore like the remnants of some massive die-off. But they were arranged in patterns, spirals, and lines that looked deliberate rather than random. Jesus, Kowalski breathed. What happened here? Anthony showed no surprise at the bone-covered beach. If anything, he seemed satisfied, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to find. David was already packing his equipment, moving with the efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. "This will do," Anthony said. "We can wade ashore from here." Kowalski cut the engine and dropped anchor 20 yards from shore. "I'll be back in 72 hours, he announced. "Noon on Sunday. If you're not here, I'm not waiting." "What if we need additional time?" Anthony asked. "Then you'll need a different boat." Kowalski's voice was flat and final. "I won't stay longer than necessary. This place," he gestured toward the bone-covered shore, "this place doesn't want visitors." We loaded our gear into a small inflatable boat and made 3 trips to ferry everything to shore. The bones crunched under our boots as we carried equipment up the beach. Some were very old, bleached white by years of weather. Others looked recent, with scraps of flesh still clinging to them. David knelt next to a spiral pattern of fish bones, taking photographs with a camera that looked more expensive than most people's cars. Anthony consulted his charts and GPS, pointing toward the dark forest that began just beyond the beach. 5 miles inland, he said. "We'll find what we need there." As Kowalski's boat disappeared toward the horizon, I looked around at my companions and felt the full weight of our isolation. We were alone on an island that felt fundamentally hostile to human presence, with clients who had clearly lied about their intentions and equipment that had nothing to do with ecosystem research. The forest ahead looked impossible to get through, a wall of twisted trees and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Somewhere in that darkness, 5 university researchers had vanished without a trace. Now we were following the same path, led by people who knew more about this place than they were willing to admit. I put on my pack and checked my GPS one final time, noting our exact coordinates. Whatever happened next, I wanted to be sure I could find my way back to this beach. Looking at the bone-covered shore and the dark water beyond, I realized that getting back here might be the difference between survival and joining the island's collection of anonymous remains. Anthony was already walking toward the forest, moving with the confidence of someone following a map rather than exploring unknown territory. David struggled with his heavy equipment cases, refusing my offers of help with increasing agitation. Robert brought up the rear, rifle ready and eyes constantly looking around our surroundings. The forest stood ahead, dark and silent and waiting. Anthony's boots crunched across the bone-covered beach as he headed straight for the forest edge, without pausing to check the area or look for safe routes. I followed, bringing David and Robert into the tree line where shadows covered us within a dozen steps. The forest was wrong from the moment we entered it. I'd guided trips through every type of Alaskan wilderness, temperate rainforest, boreal woodlands, tundra transitions. Each ecosystem had its own rhythm, its own background sounds of life. This forest was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. No insects buzzed around my face even though the air was humid. No birds called from the trees above. No squirrels chattered or small animals rustled through bushes that should have provided perfect habitat for dozens of species. The trees themselves grew in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks filled the area above, but their branches twisted in directions that went against normal growth. Instead of reaching toward available sunlight, every tree seemed to lean inward, their limbs pointing toward some central location deeper in the island's interior. Unusual growth patterns, I commented to Anthony, who was consulting his hidden map again. Soil conditions, he said without looking up. High mineral content affects development. Mineral content didn't explain why every tree for hundreds of yards grew like compass needles pointing to magnetic north. But Anthony was already moving deeper into the forest, following what might have been an animal trail if any animals actually lived here. David struggled behind us, hauling 2 metal equipment cases. The cases were military grade, with reinforced corners and heavy-duty latches that suggested they contained something more substantial than atmospheric monitoring devices. Every few minutes he paused to readjust his grip, breathing hard and sweating in the cool forest air. "Want me to take one of those?" I offered during his 3rd rest stop. "No," Anthony snapped before David could respond. "The contents are extremely fragile. Calibrated scientific instruments. David knows how to handle them properly." David nodded quickly, avoiding eye contact while picking up the cases again. Whatever was inside those cases, it wasn't fragile. The way he carried them suggested dense, heavy objects that could take a hit. We'd been hiking for 40 minutes when I noticed the first piece of evidence that we weren't the only people who'd been here recently. A strip of blue fabric hung from a thorn bush at eye level, moving slightly in the still air. The material was synthetic outdoor gear fabric, torn ragged at the edges. I stopped to look at it more closely. Someone came through here not too long ago. Robert appeared beside me, studying the fabric with professional interest. University team had blue jackets in their gear photos. The fabric looked fresh, not weathered by months of exposure. Either it had been protected from the elements somehow, or it hadn't been hanging here as long as 6 months. Anthony looked at the fabric briefly. Probably from hunters or other researchers. "This isn't hunting country," I said. "Too remote, too difficult to get game out. And you said we were the first research team to request access." Anthony was already walking away, looking at his compass and checking his watch like we were running behind schedule. David hurried to catch up, his equipment cases banging against his legs with each step. 50 yards further, I found the GPS device. It was a high-end unit, the kind university research teams used for mapping and data collection. Someone had crushed it thoroughly, not dropped or damaged by accident, but deliberately destroyed. The plastic housing was cracked into pieces, the screen was broken, and the metal components inside were twisted like someone had grabbed the device and squeezed it until it broke. Expensive piece of equipment to just abandon out here, Robert observed, crouching next to the remains. David knelt beside us, pulling out his camera to photograph the destroyed GPS. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the lens settings. Either he was more affected by the device's condition than he wanted to admit, or he was taking pictures for documentation rather than scientific interest. "Equipment failure," Anthony said from 10 feet away. "These devices aren't designed for extended wilderness exposure." I picked up the largest piece of the GPS unit. The damage wasn't consistent with dropping it on rocks or stepping on it accidentally. Something with tremendous grip strength had crushed this device, but the pattern of damage was wrong for animal claws or teeth. "What kind of animal destroys electronic equipment?" I asked. "Bears investigate anything that smells different," Robert said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own explanation. Anthony checked his watch again. "We need to stay on schedule. 3 miles inland before dark." 3 miles inland. Specific destination. Specific timeline. Everything about Anthony's behavior confirmed that he knew exactly where we were going and what we expected to find there. The forest grew thicker as we climbed away from the coastline. Massive trees blocked most of the afternoon light, creating a twilight atmosphere even though the sun wouldn't set for hours. The twisted branch patterns became more pronounced until walking between the trees felt like moving through a tunnel that pointed deeper into the island's interior. David's breathing grew heavy. The equipment cases were taking a toll on him, but he refused to slow down or accept help. Every few minutes, he checked his watch and looked at a handheld device that definitely wasn't standard hiking equipment. The screen showed readings that changed as we moved forward, like he was tracking something specific. 2 hours after entering the forest, we found the camp. The scientists' base camp sat in a small clearing surrounded by the largest trees we'd encountered. Even from 50 yards away, I could see that something terrible had happened here. Tents lay in torn pieces, their fabric scattered across the clearing like oversized confetti. Personal belongings were thrown everywhere. Sleeping bags, cooking equipment, clothing, research materials spread across an area the size of a football field. But no bodies, no human remains at all. I moved carefully through the destruction, noting what I saw. 3 tents had been slashed open with something sharp enough to cut through heavy-duty camping fabric like it was tissue paper. A camp stove had been thrown 30 feet from its original position and stuck halfway into a tree trunk. Scientific equipment lay in pieces, but not randomly broken, deliberately destroyed with the same careful thoroughness as the GPS device we'd found earlier. Dark stains covered the ground throughout the clearing. Not rust or mud. These stains had the wrong color and thickness. They'd soaked into the soil and spread up the bark of nearby trees in splash patterns that suggested significant volume and force. Robert examined the scene like a crime scene investigator, measuring distances and taking pictures of damage patterns. "Not bears," he announced after several minutes. "Wrong type of destruction." "What do you mean?" David asked, his voice higher than usual. "Bears tear things apart looking for food. They investigate, taste, discard. This is different." Robert pointed to a sleeping bag that had been sliced into ribbons. This was systematic, deliberate. Something was angry. Anthony moved through the destruction without any surprise or concern. While Robert documented evidence and David struggled with his heavy cases, Anthony walked directly to the far side of the clearing and checked his compass again. His behavior suggested he'd expected to find exactly this scene. I found a journal half buried under debris near what had been the scientist's communication tent. The pages were water-damaged but partially readable. The final entry was dated 6 months ago, 3 days before the team's last radio contact. The handwriting was shaky, getting more frantic. Sounds getting louder each night. Something large moving through the forest. Trees responding to its presence. David thinks we should leave, but Dr. Morrison insists we need more data. God help us, I think we found something that should have stayed lost. The entry ended mid-sentence as if the writer had been interrupted. I showed the journal to Robert, who read it silently before handing it back. They knew something was wrong. Anthony appeared at my shoulder. Academic speculation. Researchers often let their imaginations run wild in isolated conditions. They're all dead, I said flatly. Missing, Anthony corrected. Presumed dead. No evidence of what actually happened. I pointed at the destroyed campsite, the dark stains, the torn-apart equipment. This is evidence. Anthony's face stayed calm, but something in his eyes told me what I'd thought since the hotel meeting. He wasn't surprised by any of this because he'd known what we would find. The university scientists weren't the first people to disappear on Montague Island, and Anthony knew exactly what had killed them. David was taking pictures of everything, documenting angles and details that had nothing to do with ecosystem research. His equipment cases sat unopened beside him, but I could hear faint electronic sounds coming from inside them, beeping and buzzing that suggested active devices rather than passive scientific instruments. The afternoon light was fading fast in the thick forest. We needed to set up our own camp soon, but the destroyed clearing felt like the worst possible place to spend the night. Everything about the scene suggested we were walking into the same trap that had killed 5 university researchers. Anthony checked his watch one last time, then pointed deeper into the forest where the twisted trees made an even more pronounced tunnel of branches. 2 more miles, he announced. We'll camp near our primary research site. Primary research site. Not ecosystem study, not sample collection. Research site. Like he knew exactly what lay ahead in the darkness between those twisted trees. Robert and David began repacking their gear without question, following Anthony's lead like soldiers accepting orders from a commanding officer. But Robert's movements were more careful now, more cautious. He'd seen enough combat zones to recognize when a situation was about to get worse. I put on my pack and followed them deeper into the forest, leaving the destroyed campsite behind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the shadows between the trees, watched by whatever had killed the university scientists and was now waiting to see what we would do. Anthony knew more about this island than he'd admitted. David's equipment wasn't for atmospheric research. Robert wasn't just providing security consultation, and I was the only one on this expedition who didn't understand what we were really doing here. The twisted trees ahead pointed toward whatever lay at the center of Montague Island. 2 more miles through forest that felt increasingly hostile with each step forward. 2 more miles toward whatever had turned 5 university researchers into dark stains on the ground. Anthony walked ahead with the confidence of someone following a map toward a known destination. Behind us, the destroyed campsite fell into shadow as darkness began to claim the forest. The clearing Anthony picked for our camp was 2 miles deeper into the forest, surrounded by the same twisted trees that seemed to point toward the island's center. I dropped my pack and started checking out the site with 15 years of wilderness experience guiding my review. The ground was level and well-drained, with enough space for 4 tents and a safe distance from the largest trees in case of windfall. Under normal circumstances, this would have been an excellent campsite. But nothing about Montague Island qualified as normal circumstances. Even as I unpacked my gear, something felt fundamentally wrong about this place. The forest pressed too close around our small circle of cleared ground, creating the feeling of being watched from multiple directions at once. Every survival instinct I developed over years of guiding expeditions in remote Alaska was sending warnings I couldn't ignore. Anthony moved through the campsite setup with familiar efficiency, but not the efficiency of someone learning outdoor skills. The efficiency of someone who'd done this before, in this exact location. He positioned his tent facing a specific direction without checking compass or GPS, then started unpacking electronic equipment I hadn't seen during our gear loading at the harbor. David struggled with his heavy cases, finally opening them to show devices that had nothing to do with atmospheric research. Complex electronic units with multiple screens, cables, and sensors. Some components looked like communication equipment, others looked like geological surveying tools. Everything was military-grade and expensive, designed for specialized purposes I couldn't identify. Atmospheric monitoring, Anthony said when he noticed my attention. We need precise readings of environmental conditions. I'd guided actual atmospheric researchers before. Their equipment was standardized, recognizable, designed for specific meteorological measurements. What David was assembling looked more like equipment for underground exploration or communications interception. Robert set up a perimeter around our camp with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained in military security protocols. He placed motion sensors between trees, tested sight lines, identified defensive positions. This wasn't casual security consultation. This was preparation for combat in hostile territory. As darkness fell, the island's oppressive atmosphere became almost suffocating. I'd camped in remote locations across 6 continents, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, but never experienced such all-around wrongness. The air itself felt thick and hostile, like the island was rejecting our presence with increasing intensity. The temperature began dropping within minutes of sunset. I checked my digital thermometer 3 times, unable to believe the readings. We'd started the evening at 58 degrees, pleasant conditions for camping in late spring. By full darkness, the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees, a 20-degree drop that went against every weather forecast we'd received. I pulled on additional layers and moved closer to our camp stove for warmth. Weather Service said mild conditions all week. Anthony looked up from his electronic equipment. Microclimates. Islands create their own weather patterns. Microclimates didn't explain a 20-degree temperature drop in 40 minutes. I'd guided expeditions through mountain passes where altitude changes created dramatic temperature variations, but this was different. The cold felt unnatural, like something was actively draining heat from our surroundings. David sat next to his opened equipment cases, speaking to Anthony in whispers I couldn't quite make out. I caught fragments of conversation, coordinates, signal strength, proximity measurements. Every few minutes, one of his devices would beep or chirp, and David would check readings on multiple screens simultaneously. "What kind of atmospheric data requires coordinates?" I asked, moving closer to their work area. Anthony positioned himself between me and David's equipment. "We're mapping atmospheric pressure variations across the island's geography. Requires precise location data." The explanation sounded rehearsed, like something he'd prepared for exactly this question. Atmospheric pressure mapping didn't require the kind of heavy-duty drilling equipment I'd seen in David's cases, or the communication devices that looked designed for encrypted military transmissions. I went back to my own tent, but sleep was impossible. Every sound in the forest seemed louder and threatening. Wind moved through branches overhead with patterns that didn't match natural airflow. Small branches cracked and fell often, which suggested something large was moving through the leaves above us. Robert had volunteered for first watch, positioning himself at the edge of our clearing where he could monitor the forest approaches. Even from inside my tent, I could see his outline against the faint glow of our camp stove. He held his rifle ready, and his head turned constantly, tracking movements I couldn't detect. Around midnight, the sounds began. At first, I thought the low buzzing was equipment noise from David's devices, a deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from the ground beneath our camp. But as I listened more carefully, the sound was too organic, too purposeful to be mechanical. It had a rhythm that reminded me of breathing or a massive heartbeat, rising and falling in cycles that lasted 30 seconds each. The buzzing grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from our equipment. It was coming from the earth itself, as if something enormous was buried beneath the island and slowly awakening. I unzipped my tent and crawled outside. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and my breath formed visible clouds in the cold air. Anthony and David were huddled over their equipment, checking readings and speaking in urgent whispers. Neither seemed surprised by the buzzing sounds. Robert stood motionless at his watch position, but his posture had changed. Instead of looking around the forest for general threats, he was staring fixedly into the darkness between 2 massive trees, as if watching something specific. His rifle was raised and ready, finger on the trigger. I moved to his position, following his line of sight into the forest. At first I saw nothing but twisted branches and black shadows. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to sense movement in the black spaces between trees. Not wind stirring branches or small animals rustling through plants, something much larger, moving with deliberate purpose through the forest around our camp. "What do you see?" I whispered to Robert. "Movement," he said without turning his head. "Something large, staying just outside visual range. The buzzing from below grew stronger, joined by new sounds that made my skin crawl. Deep, cracking noises, like enormous trees falling in slow motion. But no trees were actually falling. The sounds came from beneath the ground, as if something massive was moving around in underground chambers directly below our campsite. I felt like something huge and evil was watching me. Not the casual attention of wildlife curious about human intruders, but focused, intelligent watching by something that understood exactly what we were and was deciding what to do about our presence. The realization hit me like cold water. We weren't camping in a random forest clearing. Anthony had brought us to a specific location, chosen for reasons he hadn't shared. The electronic equipment wasn't for atmospheric research. It was for communicating with or monitoring whatever lived beneath this island. David's devices were beeping more frequently now, screens showing readings that caused him and Anthony to exchange increasingly excited whispers. They weren't concerned about the temperature drop or the unnatural sounds. They were expecting these things, measuring them, documenting their intensity and frequency. The buzzing reached a peak that went through my bones, with cracking sounds so loud they seemed to shake the ground beneath our feet. Robert's rifle tracked movement in the forest that I still couldn't see clearly, but I felt the presence of something enormous circling our campsite at the edge of what I could see. Then, at exactly 3 a.m, everything stopped. The buzzing cut off instantly, as if someone had thrown a switch. The cracking sound stopped. Even the normal background noise of wind through branches disappeared completely. The silence that followed was so complete and unnatural that it felt heavy, like the island itself was holding its breath. In that perfect silence, I could hear my own pulse beating in my ears. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to the weird silence that had come over our campsite. The complete quiet felt more scary than the underground buzzing had been. At least the strange noises gave me something real to fear. This perfect silence meant something was keeping all the animals away. When morning light finally came through the twisted trees above, I crawled out of my tent to find we weren't alone on the island. 8-foot scratches were cut deep into the bark of every tree around our campsite. The marks hadn't been there when we'd set up camp. I would have noticed claw marks that size when I checked the area. Something had visited us during those hours of total silence, marking its territory while we slept. I walked to the nearest scratched tree, running my fingers along grooves cut so deep they showed the white wood underneath. The scratches were too wide for bear claws, too high for any wolverine, too clean for random damage from falling branches. Whatever had made these marks was both huge and had done it on purpose. Robert came out of his tent and walked straight to the claw marks without looking surprised they were there. He pulled out a small measuring tape and started recording the scratches with military precision, writing down depth, spacing, and height measurements in a notebook he got from his jacket pocket. 12 inches between claw tips, he said quietly. Penetration depth of 3 inches through bark into solid wood, made by something with significant mass and strength. What kind of animal makes marks like that? I asked. Robert continued measuring without looking up. Nothing in North America. His matter-of-fact tone suggested he'd encountered similar evidence before, in places where things that shouldn't exist left physical proof of their presence. He photographed the marks from multiple angles, documenting them like crime scene evidence rather than wildlife sign. Anthony appeared from his tent looking tired, as if he hadn't slept. He checked his GPS unit against a folded paper map he kept tucked inside his jacket, comparing coordinates and making small marks with a pencil. The hand-drawn map showed geographical features that didn't match any official survey I'd seen of Montague Island, additional landmarks, elevation changes, and marked locations that suggested previous exploration and documentation. "How much further to your research site?" I asked, trying to get a look at his map. Anthony quickly folded the paper and returned it to his jacket. 2 miles. We need to maintain our schedule. Schedule. He'd mentioned timing repeatedly since we'd arrived, like our expedition had to reach specific locations at predetermined moments. Research teams usually adapted their timeline to conditions and discoveries, but Anthony was following a rigid agenda that left no room for flexibility or safety considerations. David struggled to pack his equipment cases, moving slowly and checking his watch every few minutes. As he lifted the heavier case, the reinforced corner caught on a tree root, and the latch popped open. Electronic devices and cables spilled onto the ground, along with equipment that had nothing to do with atmospheric research. I helped gather the scattered items, getting a clear look at specialized drilling tools, geological surveying equipment, and communication devices designed for encrypted transmission rather than weather monitoring. One device looked like ground-penetrating radar equipment, the kind used to locate underground structures or geological formations. "Specialized surveying instruments," Anthony said quickly, moving to repack the equipment himself. "We're mapping subsurface geological features as part of our ecosystem study." He stuffed the devices back into the case with no concern for their supposed fragility, confirming my suspicion that the equipment was designed for rugged field use rather than delicate scientific measurement. Geological surveying made more sense than atmospheric research, but it still didn't explain why a legitimate scientific expedition required military-grade security, or why they'd hired me under false pretenses. We broke camp and left for deeper parts of the forest, following what appeared to be a very old trail that wound between the largest trees. The path was too straight and well-defined to be a random animal track, suggesting humans had used this route for generations before the island became officially uninhabited. The twisted trees grew even more pronounced as we climbed toward the island's interior. Their branches pointed consistently toward our destination, creating a natural corridor that guided travelers in a specific direction. Walking between them felt like following a deliberate design rather than navigating natural wilderness. 3 hours into our hike, the forest around us changed in ways I couldn't identify precisely. The air became thicker, harder to breathe, as if we were climbing to higher altitude, even though the terrain remained relatively level. The temperature continued dropping gradually, going against the morning sunshine that should have warmed the forest floor. David's handheld device began beeping more frequently, its screen showing readings that caused him to whisper urgently to Anthony. They were tracking something, monitoring its location, measuring its proximity, following signals that led us deeper into the island's center. Robert suddenly stopped in the middle of the trail and raised his rifle to firing position. His movements were smooth and practiced, muscle memory from combat situations where hesitation meant death. He aimed down the barrel toward something in the forest ahead, finger on the trigger, breathing, controlled and steady. I followed his line of sight between distant trees, searching for whatever had triggered his reaction. At first, I saw only shadows and twisted branches, the same thick forest we'd been hiking through all morning. But as I watched, one of the shadows moved independently of the others. Something massive moved between tree trunks 50 yards ahead, dark and enormous and walking upright like a human but moving with fluid grace that suggested predatory awareness. The shape was too large to be a person, too coordinated to be a bear, too purposeful to be random movement of branches in the wind. I tried to focus on it clearly, but the creature stayed in the darkest spaces between trees where details were impossible to distinguish. All I could determine was size, significantly larger than any wildlife I'd encountered in 15 years of guiding. And intelligence. The deliberate way it moved suggested planning and intention rather than instinctive behavior. The shape vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, melting back into the forest shadows without sound or disturbance to the surrounding vegetation. If I hadn't been watching carefully, I might have dismissed it as imagined movement or optical illusion caused by strain and fear. Robert lowered his rifle slowly, but his hands shook slightly as he released the trigger. Sweat beaded on his forehead in spite of the cold air, and his eyes continued looking around the forest with heightened alertness. "What was that?" I asked. "Shadows," he said quietly. "Light playing tricks between the trees." But his voice carried no conviction, and he kept his rifle ready as we started hiking again. Whatever he'd seen through his scope had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Combat veterans didn't usually jump at shadows or waste ammunition on optical illusions. Anthony checked his hidden map again, comparing our position to markings that showed we were approaching our final destination. His excitement was barely controlled now, like a collector about to acquire a prize he'd been seeking for years. "How much further?" David asked, struggling with his equipment cases. "Less than a mile," Anthony replied, consulting his GPS one more time. "We should reach the site by early afternoon." Site. Not research area or sampling location, site, like a specific landmark or installation that he'd visited before or studied extensively. Everything about his behavior suggested he knew our destination, knowledge of what we would find there, preparation for events he expected to unfold. I'd guided enough expeditions to recognize the difference between exploration and pilgrimage. Anthony wasn't leading us to an unknown location for scientific research. He was returning to a place he knew, following maps drawn by previous visitors, equipped with tools designed for a specific purpose I still didn't understand. The realization hit me as we continued deeper into the forest. My clients weren't researchers studying Montague Island's ecosystem. They weren't even treasure hunters or thrill seekers exploring remote wilderness for adventure. They were hunting something that lived in the island's interior, tracking it with specialized equipment, prepared to capture or kill whatever they found. And I was the guide who'd brought them here, involved in an expedition that had already cost 5 university researchers their lives. The trees around us got bigger as we hiked deeper into the island's middle, but nothing prepared me for what we found after 5 hours of steady climbing through the twisted forest. The huge Sitka spruce that took over the clearing ahead was bigger than every tree I'd seen in 15 years of guiding trips across Alaska. I stopped walking and looked up, trying to figure out how tall it really was compared to the trees around it. 300 feet tall, easily. Maybe more. The trunk was at least 20 feet across, a living monument that had grown here for centuries while the rest of the forest bent and twisted around it. Anthony moved toward the giant tree with purpose, no longer bothering to check his hidden map or GPS unit. This was our destination, the exact spot he'd been heading toward since we'd left the destroyed campsite. He walked like someone approaching a place he'd traveled across continents to visit, but something was totally wrong with how the tree looked. Sitka spruces in southeast Alaska got pretty big in old-growth forests, but this one was way beyond normal growth patterns for the species by hundreds of years. The bark was too dark, almost black, and the huge trunk was split by a jagged crack that ran from ground level up 30 feet into the main body of the tree. The crack made a natural opening into the tree's hollow inside, wide enough for a person to walk through standing up. As we got closer, I realized the split wasn't natural damage from storms or lightning strikes. It was too clean, too planned, like something had deliberately carved an entrance into the living wood. "Incredible specimen," Anthony said, though his voice carried excitement rather than scientific appreciation. "Probably 800 years old, maybe more." I'd guided forestry researchers before, and 800 years would make this one of the oldest recorded Sitka spruces in Alaska. But age alone didn't explain the tree's huge presence, or the way it seemed to soak up light rather than bounce it back. The massive trunk looked darker than the shadows around it, creating an optical illusion that made my eyes hurt when I tried to focus on its surface. David dropped his equipment cases and immediately began unpacking devices I hadn't seen during our previous stops. drilling equipment with diamond-tipped bits designed for core sampling, ground-penetrating radar units, geological surveying tools that had nothing to do with atmospheric research or ecosystem studies. Core samples, Anthony explained when he noticed my attention. We need to analyze the tree's growth patterns and mineral absorption from the surrounding soil. Forestry researchers took core samples with simple hand tools, not industrial drilling equipment designed for geological exploration. David's machinery was powerful enough to drill through solid rock, suggesting they expected to encounter materials much harder than normal wood fiber. As David assembled his drilling apparatus, I approached the crack in the tree's trunk. The opening was large enough to walk through, but something about the hollow interior made me reluctant to get too close. The darkness inside seemed thicker than normal shadows, almost solid, like looking into deep water rather than empty space. I pulled my flashlight from my pack and pointed the beam into the tree's hollow center. The light went only a few feet before being swallowed by complete blackness. The interior space appeared much larger than the tree's exterior dimensions should have allowed, as if the hollow extended far deeper into the earth than the visible trunk. "Don't go inside," Robert said quietly, positioning himself between the tree and the forest behind us. He held his rifle ready and scanned the surrounding area with military alertness, as if expecting attack from multiple directions. "Why not?" I asked, though every instinct was telling me to stay away from the opening. Bad tactical position, no exit strategy. His explanation made sense from a security perspective, but something in his tone suggested personal experience with places where entering meant not coming back out. He'd seen locations where curiosity killed people, and this tree triggered the same warning systems. I pointed my flashlight beam along the inner walls of the hollow space, trying to understand the tree's internal structure. The light revealed something that made my blood freeze, symbols carved deep into the wood, covering every visible surface of the interior walls. "Anthony," I called, "you need to see this." He hurried over with David close behind, both carrying cameras and measurement tools. When Anthony saw the carvings inside the tree, his face lit up with the satisfaction of someone whose theories had just been confirmed. The symbols covered the hollow interior like an old library written in wood. Geometric patterns, spirals, and markings that looked like no writing system I'd ever seen. The carvings were old, very old, cut so deeply into the living wood that they'd become part of the tree's structure as it continued growing around them. "Pre-Columbian," Anthony whispered, photographing the symbols with obsessive thoroughness. "Predating any known native Alaskan cultures by centuries." I'd guided archaeologists through sites containing native artifacts, and these symbols were different from any indigenous writing I'd seen. The patterns were too complex, too systematic, suggesting an advanced civilization that had inhabited this island long before recorded history. David began taking measurements of the carvings with digital calipers, recording dimensions and spacing with scientific precision. But his equipment cases contained more than measurement tools. I caught sight of translation software, linguistic analysis programs, and historical reference materials that suggested extensive preparation for exactly these discoveries. "How did you know these would be here?" I asked Anthony. "Research," he said, adjusting his camera settings for better detail shots. Historical accounts, local legends, previous expeditions that documented similar findings. Previous expeditions. He'd mentioned other researchers had studied this island, but Coast Guard records indicated no successful scientific missions to Montague Island in recent decades. Either Anthony had access to classified information, or he was referring to unofficial expeditions that hadn't been reported to authorities. The temperature around the tree was noticeably colder than the surrounding forest. I checked my digital thermometer and discovered a 15-degree difference between our current location and the clearing where we'd eaten lunch 2 hours earlier. The cold seemed to come from the tree itself, as if something inside was actively drawing heat from the surrounding air. David put together his drilling equipment and began boring into the tree trunk at precise locations he marked with his GPS unit. The diamond-tipped bit cut through the dark bark easily, but when it reached the interior wood, the drill motor began working harder, as if hitting much harder material. "Mineral deposits," David explained, checking readouts on his drilling apparatus. "High concentrations of metallic elements in the wood fiber. Trees could absorb minerals from soil and groundwater, but the drill's difficulty suggested metal content far exceeding normal botanical levels. As David's equipment worked, fine shavings of wood fell from the drill hole, but the shavings were dark gray, almost metallic, rather than the pale yellow of normal spruce wood. I walked around the tree's base looking for other evidence of unusual characteristics. The ground within 30 feet of the trunk was empty of all vegetation except the tree itself. No bushes, no fallen branches with new shoots, no moss or lichens on the bark. The tree stood in a perfect circle of dead earth, as if its presence poisoned the soil around it. Robert stayed in his position between the tree and the forest, but his attention was focused on the hollow interior rather than external threats. He held his rifle ready and watched the opening with the focus of someone expecting something to emerge. "We need to leave," I told Anthony. "This place isn't safe." Anthony looked up from his photography. "We need more documentation. Measurements, samples, detailed analysis of the symbol systems." "Accidents happen in remote locations," Anthony replied, returning to his camera work. "Poor preparation, inadequate equipment, failure to follow safety protocols." But the destroyed campsite we'd found hadn't shown evidence of accidents or equipment failure. The systematic destruction, the claw marks, the deliberate targeting of electronic devices all suggested intelligent, purposeful violence by something that understood human technology and wanted to eliminate it. David's drilling equipment produced more metallic wood shavings, along with a sound that made my teeth ache. Not the normal whine of drill bits cutting through organic material, but a low harmonic vibration that seemed to bounce through the ground beneath our feet. As afternoon light faded toward evening, the temperature around the tree dropped even further. My breath began forming visible clouds despite the relatively mild weather we'd experienced during our hike. The cold wasn't natural. It was too focused on this specific location. Too intense. I walked up to the tree's hollow interior again, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and dread. The darkness inside seemed to pulse slightly, expanding and contracting like something breathing. I told myself it was optical illusion caused by my flashlight beam moving, but the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. Then I heard it clearly, slow, deep breathing from somewhere inside the tree's hollow center. Not wind moving through empty space, but the deliberate inhalation and exhalation of something large and alive, breathing in measured rhythms that suggested consciousness and awareness. I stepped back from the tree's opening as the breathing sounds grew louder and more deliberate. The rhythm wasn't random air movement through hollow wood. Something alive was drawing measured breaths from deep inside the tree's interior, something large enough to move significant volumes of air with each inhalation. Anthony continued photographing the carved symbols, not noticing the sounds that made my skin crawl. David worked over his drilling equipment, adjusting settings and checking readouts with scientific focus. Robert stayed between us and the forest, but his attention was fixed on the tree's entrance like he was waiting for something specific to happen. David's drilling operation finally extracted a core sample from deep inside the trunk. The cylindrical piece of wood he pulled from the borehole was unlike anything I'd seen in 15 years of wilderness work. Instead of normal pale spruce, the sample was dark gray with metallic streaks running through the grain. When David dropped it into a collection container, the sample made a metallic clink rather than the soft thud of organic material. "Fascinating mineral absorption," David whispered to Anthony, sealing the container with hands that shook from excitement rather than cold. concentrations that shouldn't be possible in living tissue. Anthony packed his cameras and moved closer to the tree's opening, drawn by whatever he expected to find inside. The breathing sounds had grown more pronounced, accompanied by faint scratching noises that suggested movement against the interior walls. "We should set up camp," I said, desperate to get distance between us and whatever was breathing inside that tree. "Find higher ground, defensible position." "No," Anthony replied without looking away from the hollow opening. "This is exactly where we need to be." His certainty confirmed my worst suspicions. Anthony hadn't brought us here for research or exploration. He'd come to make contact with whatever lived inside the tree. The breathing sounds, the carved symbols, the metallic wood samples. Everything was going according to his hidden plan. Robert got into position with clear sight lines in multiple directions, rifle ready, finger near the trigger. His military training had kicked into high alert, recognizing a situation where violence was not just possible, but about to happen. The breathing from inside the tree changed tempo, becoming faster and more urgent. The scratching sounds got louder, like claws scraping against wood, working toward the opening we stood beside. "Something's coming," Robert said quietly, raising his rifle to firing position. Anthony's face lit up with excitement rather than fear. Finally. The word carried years of preparation, research, and planning. Anthony had known exactly what we would find on Montague Island, had equipped his team specifically for this encounter, had hired me to guide them to a predetermined meeting with whatever was about to come out from the very old tree. The scratching sounds grew louder, closer to the opening. David grabbed his equipment cases and backed away from the tree. But Anthony stood his ground with cameras ready, prepared to document whatever appeared. A massive shape began moving inside the hollow space, blocking what little light got through the darkness. Something enormous was positioning itself near the opening, preparing to come out into the clearing where we waited. The creature that crawled from the tree's interior went against every assumption I'd made about wildlife in southeast Alaska. It looked like a bear in basic body structure, 4 legs, massive torso, distinct head, but no bear had ever reached such impossible size or moved with such deliberate, calculated intelligence. 12 feet tall when it reared onto its hind legs, easily 800 pounds of muscle and bone covered in patchy fur that hung in rotting clumps from gray, decomposing flesh. The smell hit me first. Sweet decay mixed with something metallic and wrong, like meat left in standing water for months. But the eyes destroyed any possibility this was normal wildlife. They burned with pale fire that had nothing to do with bounced light. Intelligence that was very old and evil and completely aware of our presence. The creature studied each of us individually, cataloging our positions and capabilities with the methodical assessment of a predator that had hunted humans before. Anthony raised his camera with trembling hands, trying to photograph the creature as it came out fully from the tree. The flash triggered an immediate response. The creature's head snapped toward Anthony with frightening speed, and those burning eyes fixed on him with unmistakable intent. "Magnificent," Anthony whispered. "Absolutely magnificent." The creature moved toward him with smooth movements that seemed too easy for something so big. It covered the distance between tree and man in 3 quiet steps across the forest floor. Anthony's scream lasted less than 2 seconds. The creature's claws, each one the size and shape of a machete blade, closed around his torso. I heard ribs breaking like kindling wood before Anthony's voice cut off. David dropped his equipment cases and ran toward the forest, crashing through bushes with panic. The creature watched his movement without releasing Anthony's body, then jumped after David with surprising speed for something so huge. David made it perhaps 50 yards before the creature caught him. A single swipe of those huge claws caught him across the head and shoulders, and David fell without making a sound. The creature stood over his still body for a moment, then turned back toward our clearing where Robert and I stayed frozen. Robert opened fire immediately, his rifle cracking repeatedly as he put round after round into the creature's body. I watched bullets hit, saw them tear through rotting flesh and expose the gray bones underneath. But the creature showed no reaction to the hits. It took the gunfire like rain, moving steadily toward Robert with those intelligent eyes locked on his position. Robert's rifle clicked empty after his 10th shot. He reached for a fresh magazine, but the creature closed the distance before he could reload. The backhand blow sent Robert flying 30 feet through the air before he crashed into a huge spruce with a sound like breaking wood. He hit the trunk at chest level and dropped to the ground, motionless. I grabbed my pack and ran. Every survival instinct I'd developed in 15 years of wilderness guiding told me to put distance between myself and that clearing. I crashed through bushes, stumbled over fallen logs, tore through thorn bushes that ripped my jacket and pack. Behind me, inhuman roars carried through the forest, sounds that belonged to no creature that should exist in Alaska or anywhere else on Earth. The noise was rage and hunger and something else, disappointment maybe, like the creature had expected different results from our encounter. I pulled out my GPS unit while running, checking our position relative to the coastline where the fishing boat was scheduled to return. 8 miles of dense forest lay between me and the rocky shore, but I had no choice except to keep moving. The creature chased me at first. I could hear huge footsteps crashing through plants, trees breaking as something enormous forced its way between them. But after a quarter mile, the sounds faded and eventually stopped completely. I kept running anyway, driven by terror and the certainty that slowing down meant death. The creature had seemed reluctant to leave the immediate area around its tree, like it was bound to that specific location. But I couldn't risk assuming anything about its behavior or limitations. I ran through the night, following my GPS toward the coast. The twisted trees that had pointed us toward the island's interior now guided my escape route, their branches showing the direction back to the water. My flashlight beam showed the same unnatural forest we'd hiked through during the day, but darkness made everything more threatening and alien. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. I fell repeatedly on unseen roots and rocks, picked myself up, and kept moving. My GPS showed steady progress toward the coastline, but the forest seemed endless in the darkness. By dawn, I reached the rocky shore where Captain Kowalski had dropped us 3 days earlier. I collapsed on the bone-covered beach, gasping for breath and checking my watch. The fishing vessel was scheduled to return at noon, 6 hours away. I spent those hours watching the forest edge, expecting the creature to emerge from the trees and finish what it had started in the clearing. But nothing moved in the shadows between the trunks. The island's interior remained silent and still, as if the violence of the previous night had never happened. At exactly 12 o'clock, the northern wind appeared on the horizon. Captain Kowalski brought his boat to the same narrow inlet where he'd dropped us off, and I waded into the cold water to meet the inflatable boat he sent to shore. "Where are the others?" he asked as he pulled me aboard. I collapsed on the deck, unable to form words that would explain what had happened in the forest. How could I tell him about the creature, the ancient tree, the systematic murder of 3 men by something that shouldn't exist? "Dead," I finally managed. "They're all dead." Kowalski studied my torn clothes, the scratches covering my arms and face, the empty terror in my eyes. He asked no more questions during the 8-hour journey back to Seward, but I caught him watching me with the careful attention of someone who'd seen traumatized survivors before and understood they needed space to process whatever had broken them. I stared at the wood-burning stove in my cabin, watching orange flames flash behind the glass door. 3 years had passed since I'd spoken those words to Captain Kowalski on the deck of the Northern Wind, but I could still hear my own voice saying, "They're all dead," with the hollow certainty of someone who'd watched it happen. The authorities had been thorough in their investigation. I'll give them credit for that. Alaska State Troopers, Coast Guard investigators, FBI agents who specialized in missing persons cases in remote locations. They'd interviewed me for hours, recorded every detail I could provide about the expedition's timeline, equipment, and personnel. I told them about the destroyed campsite, the claw marks on trees, the old symbols carved inside the massive spruce. What I hadn't told them about was the creature. Not because I didn't try. I'd started that conversation 3 different times during formal interviews, describing the rotting bear-like monster that had crawled from the tree and killed 3 men with surgical precision. Each time, I'd watched their expressions change from professional attention to barely concealed concern about my mental state. Trauma-induced hallucinations, they'd written in their reports. Survivors' guilt manifesting as supernatural explanations for natural disasters. Without physical evidence, bodies, equipment, proof of the creature's existence, my account became just another story from a guide who'd lost clients to Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. The official conclusion listed the expedition's fate as presumed dead due to adverse environmental conditions and possible wildlife encounter. The settlement check from Anthony Bianchi's estate had been substantial enough to buy this cabin 15 miles outside Fairbanks, along with enough left over to survive on for a few years if I was careful. I'd combine that money with disability payments. The PTSD diagnosis had been surprisingly easy to obtain, and occasional odd jobs when I needed extra cash. I hadn't returned to wilderness guiding. The thought of leading anyone into Alaska's remote areas made my hands shake and my breathing turn shallow. Every forest looked like Montague Island's twisted trees. Every client who called asking about expeditions could be another collector seeking monsters in the wilderness. My research into Anthony Bianchi had taken months of careful internet investigation and requests to public records offices. The man had been worth approximately $40 million, with most of his wealth inherited from a grandfather who'd made a fortune in steel production during World War II. But Anthony had spent his adult life collecting artifacts and manuscripts related to what he called liminal entities, creatures that existed at the boundaries between our world and others. His estate's private library, auctioned off after his death, had contained first-edition books on cryptozoology, old folklore, and occult practices dating back centuries. The auction catalog listed grimoires written in languages most scholars couldn't identify, along with maps marking remote locations across 6 continents, where similar creatures had allegedly been encountered. Anthony hadn't been a casual enthusiast or academic researcher. He'd been a hunter, tracking down legends and myths with the systematic approach of someone who believed they were real. Montague Island had been just one stop on a global expedition spanning decades. David Doyle's background had been easier to investigate through academic channels. He'd been fired from 3 different universities for conducting unauthorized excavations at Native American sacred sites, always claiming his research would revolutionize understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations. His published papers before his academic downfall had focused on unusual artifacts that suggested contact between old American cultures and unknown outside influences. The drilling equipment he'd brought to the island made sense now. David had been searching for physical evidence to support his theories about old entities, hoping to find proof that would restore his destroyed reputation. Robert Heller remained a mystery. His military records were classified at levels that required federal security clearance to access. When I'd tried reaching out to veterans organizations, most had never heard of him. The few who had knew only that he'd served in special operations units that didn't officially exist, conducting missions in locations that weren't supposed to have American military presence. I kept a police scanner running constantly in my cabin, monitoring emergency frequencies across Alaska. Every search and rescue operation, every missing persons report, Every unexplained wilderness incident caught my attention. I was waiting for the announcement that would confirm my worst fears. Another expedition heading to Montague Island. The Coast Guard had received my warnings politely but dismissively. I'd called their Anchorage office 6 times in the first year after the expedition, trying to explain the island's dangers to whoever would listen. They'd filed my concerns under survivor trauma reports and suggested I seek professional counseling for my ongoing anxiety. The problem was that I couldn't prove the creature still existed without returning to the island myself, and I couldn't return to the island without guaranteeing my own death. So I remained trapped in my cabin, monitoring news reports and radio chatter, waiting for evidence that someone else had discovered what lurked in Alaska's remote wilderness. Sleep came in 2-hour fragments interrupted by dreams that weren't quite dreams. I'd find myself standing in that clearing again, watching the massive shape emerge from the old tree. But in these nighttime visions, the creature's burning eyes held recognition rather than simple predatory intelligence. It remembered me specifically, remembered that I'd escaped when the others had died. Sometimes I woke up convinced the creature was hunting for me, following my trail from Montague Island across hundreds of miles of wilderness to this cabin outside Fairbanks. I'd installed motion sensors around my property and kept a loaded rifle beside my bed, but I knew those precautions were mostly psychological comfort. If the creature wanted to find me, metal and electricity wouldn't stop it. The worst part was understanding that Anthony Bianchi's death had solved nothing. His library had been sold to collectors and museums around the world, spreading his research to dozens of new treasure hunters who might piece together his work. Other wealthy enthusiasts were studying his maps, planning their own expeditions to remote locations where old entities waited to be discovered. I kept emergency supplies packed in a waterproof duffel bag beside my front door. Cold weather gear, camping equipment, GPS units, enough food and water for a week in the wilderness. Not because I planned to return to Montague Island, but because I knew that someday I might have no choice. I was the only person who understood what actually lived in that twisted forest, the only survivor who'd seen the creature and escaped to tell about it. If another expedition disappeared on the island, if investigators started asking the same questions Anthony had asked, if the creature's existence became public knowledge, I might be the only one capable of stopping what would happen next. The flames in my wood stove burned lower, requiring another log to maintain heat through the long Alaskan night. I added fuel to the fire and settled back into my chair, listening to the scanner's static and waiting for news I hoped would never come.